What if the most vibrant celebrations you've ever seen weren't just about joy, but also about confronting death itself? Picture this: a civilization where festivals weren't merely parties, but profound acts of reverence, where the living and the dead shared the same sacred space, and where every feast, every dance, every chant carried the weight of eternity. This was ancient Rome, a world where life and death weren't opposites but partners in a grand, unending cycle. Their festivals weren't just events, they were portals into a mindset that saw beauty in the fleeting and power in the eternal. And today, we're stepping through that portal together. Think about the last time you celebrated something: a birthday, a holiday, maybe a personal milestone. Now imagine infusing that moment with rituals so intense, so layered with meaning, that they could make you laugh and weep in the same breath. That's what Roman festivities were like. They honored gods with wild processions, communed with ancestors through midnight offerings, and even staged mock battles where the line between performer and spirit seemed to vanish. These weren't just traditions, they were acts of defiance against oblivion, a way to say, "We remember, and so we endure." And the sheer variety of these celebrations, 33 of which we're about to explore, will leave you in awe of how deeply the Romans understood the dance between existence and what lies beyond. So why does this matter to us today? Because these festivals weren't just about the past, they were about the universal human struggle to make sense of our own mortality. The Romans didn't shy away from death, they invited it to the table, gave it a seat at the feast, and in doing so, found a way to live more fully. As we uncover these rituals from the raucous Saturnalia, where masters served slaves, to the solemn Parentalia, where families whispered to their ancestors in the dark, you'll start to see how these traditions shaped Rome's identity, its politics, even its wars. This isn't just history, it's a mirror, and by the end of this journey, you might just find yourself asking, how do we celebrate life when we know it won't last forever? The Saturnalia wasn't just a party, it was a controlled explosion of chaos, a week-long rebellion against the rigid order of Roman life. Imagine the streets of Rome in mid-December, masters serving meals to their slaves, gambling dens thrown open to all, and the air thick with the scent of honey cakes and spiced wine. Even the sternest senators traded their togas for colorful, mismatched garb, while children crowned with wreaths raced through crowds shouting, "Io Saturnalia," the ancient equivalent of happy holidays. But this wasn't mere debauchery. Every act of role reversal, from slaves commanding their owners to commoners donning the purple stripes of nobility, carried profound symbolism. Saturnalia recreated the mythical golden age of Saturn's rule, a time before social hierarchies, when the earth yielded bounty without labor and humans lived in harmony. By temporarily dismantling class barriers, Romans didn't just celebrate, they reenacted a divine memory, proving equality wasn't just possible but had once been sacred. Yet there was a shadow beneath the glitter, the festival's timing coinciding with the winter solstice. The year's darkest night was no accident. As revelers lit candles to push back the darkness, they mirrored Saturn's dual role as both harvest god and lord of time's inevitable decay. The very gifts exchanged small figurines called sigillaria, often doubled as tokens for the dead, linking the season's joy to the quiet presence of ancestors. Even the king of Saturnalia, a mock ruler chosen by lottery, embodied this tension. Crowned with laurel but destined to be dethroned by week's end, his brief reign mirrored human life itself, glorious, fleeting, and subject to forces beyond control. What makes Saturnalia truly remarkable is how it channeled existential dread into collective catharsis. By inverting norms, Romans didn't just escape reality, they confronted it. The slave who tasted power for 7 days returned to servitude with a whispered truth. Hierarchies were man-made, not eternal. The master who knelt to serve glimpsed his own fragility. And when the festival ended with a solemn sacrifice at Saturn's temple, the message was clear. Joy and mortality weren't opposites, they were threads in the same tapestry, woven together by the loom of time. Modern echoes linger. Think of Christmas's gift-giving or New Year's resolutions, but Saturnalia's raw honesty about life's impermanence remains its most startling legacy. While Saturnalia reveled in chaos, the Lemuria whispered in the dark, a festival where Romans didn't celebrate the dead but negotiated with them. Picture a silent house at midnight, the patriarch barefoot, his mouth stuffed with black beans, flicking them over his shoulder one by one while chanting, "With these I redeem me and mine." No laughter, no feasting, just the quiet urgency of a ritual older than Rome itself. This was no theatrical haunt. It was a desperate plea to the Lemures, restless spirits of the unburied dead who clawed at the walls of the living world. Unlike today's Halloween, where ghosts are costumes and candy, the Lemuria acknowledged something far more unsettling, that the dead weren't just memories but active, hungry forces. The beans weren't arbitrary. In Roman belief, these humble seeds pulsed with life literally. Their round, fertile shape symbolized resurrection, their black hue mirroring the shadow realm. Tossing them was no mere offering, it was a trade. Take this life and leave ours, each throw seemed to say, and the bare feet, a deliberate vulnerability, showing the spirits the living had come unarmed in humility. But the most haunting detail, the ritual's timing the odd-numbered nights of May, when the veil between worlds was thought to fray. Romans didn't just fear ghosts, they scheduled their appeasement, marking calendars like we might note a dentist appointment. What's striking is how the Lemuria reveals Roman pragmatism even in the supernatural. This wasn't blind terror, it was a system. Families kept bronze bull roarers, clattering them to drive off spirits after the beans were thrown. They washed hands in pure spring water, not just to cleanse but to sever invisible ties. Even the chant's wording, "Redeem me and mine," affirmed the dead as creditors in a cosmic debt. And here's the twist, the Lemures weren't strangers. They were often one's own ancestors, souls denied proper burial or wronged in life, now turning their anguish on the living. The festival wasn't about monsters under the bed. It was about guilt, about the unspoken wounds families carried across generations. Modern cultures might dismiss this as superstition, but the Lemuria's genius was its honesty. Romans didn't pretend death was tidy or that the past stayed buried. They knew memory had teeth. When a senator scattered beans in his atrium, he wasn't just warding off phantoms, he was admitting that history could strangle the present if left unchecked. Compare that to today's ghost stories where specters are entertainment. The Lemuria forced confrontation. What if the dead weren't just stories? What if they were waiting for you to remember? The Parentalia stood in stark contrast to Rome's raucous festivals. No parades, no feasts, just the hushed murmur of families kneeling at weathered tombstones as February's chill lingered in the air. For 9 days, the city transformed, courts adjourned, market stalls stood empty, even the temple's heavy bronze doors swung shut, as if the gods themselves stepped aside to make room for the dead. This wasn't mourning, it was communion. Families brought simple offerings, sprigs of violet, crumbs of salt cake, sips of wine poured directly onto graves, not as sacrifices, but as shared meals with those who'd gone before. A daughter might whisper news of a newborn to her grandfather's ashes. A soldier could lean against his brother's tomb, recounting battles fought since last they spoke. The Romans called it Parentalia to appease the parents, but the ritual was anything but fearful. It was intimacy frozen in time. What made the Parentalia extraordinary was its quiet rebellion against oblivion. In a society obsessed with legacy, where names carved in stone meant immortality, these offerings weren't just sentimental, they were contractual. The dead relied on the living for remembrance, and in return they guarded the family's fortunes. Neglect them, and the deep parents, the ancestral spirits, might turn vengeful, haunting homes as lemures, but tend to them faithfully, and they became lairs, protective deities woven into the household's very walls. This duality shaped Roman identity. When a nobleman placed a honeyed olive on his mother's grave, he wasn't just honoring her, he was renewing a covenant that bound generations. The festival's taboos reveal how seriously Rome took this bond. No weddings could be held during Parentalia, as joy clashed with reverence. Magistrates removed their badges of office, leveling all citizens into equal mourners. Even the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, performed a public rite at the tomb of Tarpeia. A traitor whose punishment, crushed by enemy shields, was so gruesome that her spirit demanded collective placation. Here, the personal and political merged. By honoring ancestors, Romans didn't just heal private grief, they reforged the chain linking past glories to future ambitions. Modern cultures might dismiss this as ancestor worship, but the Parentalia's genius was its psychological depth. The offerings weren't generic, they were tailored. A father's favorite dates left in the clay jar where his ashes slept, a sister's childhood doll buried beside her. These weren't symbols, they were conversations. And when the festival closed with the Ferralia on February 21st, as families lit midnight lamps to guide spirits back to the underworld, the message was clear. Death ended a life, not a relationship. Today's memorials, flowers on graves, candles for loved ones echo the Parentalia, but rarely with its unflinching focus. The Romans didn't just remember, they kept setting a place at the table for voices only they could hear. Imagine a festival where petals rained from the sky, stages overflowed with riotous comedies, and the streets pulsed with dancers wearing nothing but flower crowns. This was the Floralia, Rome's ode to spring's riotous rebirth, where the city shed its dignity along with winter's chill. For 6 days in late April, the stern marble facades of temples and forums softened under cascades of blossoms as Flora, the goddess who coaxed buds from barren branches, received her due. But beneath the festival's kaleidoscopic surface lurked a paradox as old as nature itself. The same event that celebrated life's exuberance also staged its fragility, turning revelry into a meditation on how quickly beauty fades. The games were the stuff of legend. Actors performed mimes so scandalous that Cicero once fled the theater in outrage, while crowds roared at satirical plays mocking politicians and gods alike. Women rarely seen in public roles took center stage, their saffron-dyed robes swirling as they danced in honor of Flora's legendary patronage of sex workers. Even the beasts released into the Circus Maximus carried layered meaning. Hares tumbling through the stands weren't just playful symbols of fertility. Their frantic darting mirrored the fleeting rush of spring, while their eventual capture by spectators served as a grim reminder. Life's vitality always ends in the hunter's grasp. Goats sacred to Venus rampaged through the crowds, their horns glinting emblems of lust's untamable force. What made the Floralia truly unsettling was its deliberate blurring of boundaries. Prostitutes performed nude at state-funded theaters, not as exploitation but as devotion, embodying Flora's gift of unashamed pleasure. Yet as night fell, torches lit the streets not just for illumination but to mimic the inevitable blaze of summer that would wither the very flowers being celebrated. The goddess herself was no gentle nurturer. Ancient hymns described Flora as a deity who laughs at the frost, her power lying in defiance, not tenderness. She was spring's victorious general, trampling winter's bones beneath her sandals. Modern eyes might see the Floralia as mere hedonism, but its brilliance lay in its honesty. Romans didn't pretend spring lasted forever. They reveled precisely because it didn't. When they crowned statues with poppies flowers that bloomed gloriously only to drop their petals in hours, they weren't just decorating. They were composing a hymn to temporality itself. Today's May Day festivals, with their maypoles and flower baskets, inherit fragments of this spirit, but none dare embrace Flora's full lesson. To truly honor life, one must also kneel before its inevitable decay. The Floralia's legacy isn't just in its wild theatrics, but in its courage to lace every joyful shout with a whisper, "This too shall pass." On a dusty April morning, just as the wheat fields began to ripple with the promise of harvest, Rome's farmers gathered along the Via Claudia, not to celebrate but to bargain. At the heart of their plea stood an unlikely figure, Robigus, the god who didn't bring blight but was the blight, his very name meaning wheat rust. Here, in a grove heavy with the scent of crushed grain, they led a red dog to the altar, its fur the color of the very disease they feared. The sacrifice wasn't an act of cruelty, it was a desperate calculus. To spare their fields, they offered destruction itself a taste of death. The ritual's precision reveals how deeply Romans understood nature's brutal balance. The dog wasn't chosen at random. Red mirrored the copper-colored fungus that could turn golden fields to ruin in weeks. Its youth symbolized the fresh threat of each growing season, while its gender, often male, reflected the aggressive spread of the blight. As the knife fell, the farmers chanted not for mercy but for a contract. Take this life so ours may thrive. Even the date, April 25th, was strategic. It marked the critical moment when spring's warmth risked tipping into the damp conditions that invited disaster. This wasn't superstition, it was agricultural science wrapped in divine theater. What's startling is how the Robigalia framed destruction as a necessary ally. Unlike festivals that shunned death, this one acknowledged its power by directing it. The procession to the grove, led by the flame Quirinales, Rome's priest of sacred agriculture, included not just prayers but practical measures. Farmers carried branches stripped from blighted plants, waving them like battle standards before burning them as a warning. The message was clear: decay could be harnessed, its energy diverted like a river to spare what mattered most. Modern farmers might spray fungicides, but the principle remains. Some losses must be accepted to save the whole. The festival's aftermath held another layer of genius. After the sacrifice, competitors raced through the fields, their feet pounding the earth to awaken its fertility. It was a defiant act of life in the face of death's shadow, a reminder that survival wasn't just about preventing loss but fueling renewal. Today's rituals, crop rotations, controlled burns, echo this duality. The Robigalia didn't just ask for protection, it acknowledged a truth we still grapple with. Sometimes, to preserve what feeds us, we must first feed the hunger of the very forces that threaten to consume it. As the last whispers of winter clung to Rome on the 21st of February, the city's streets emptied once more, but this time not in fear. The Ferralia arrived as the solemn crescendo of the Parentalia, a day when grief wasn't private but shared, when tombs became dining tables, and the boundary between the living and the dead dissolved into something tender. Families didn't just visit graves, they dwelt there, unpacking baskets of bread, olives, and wine as if setting a table for guests who'd stepped out momentarily. The air hummed with murmured conversations, a son updating his father on a promotion, a widow brushing dust from a name carved decades earlier, children listening wide-eyed as elders recounted stories of faces they'd never met. This wasn't mourning, it was reunion. What set the Ferralia apart was its radical warmth. Unlike the Lemuria's defensive bean-tossing or the Robigalia's tense bargains, this festival operated on a startling premise. The dead weren't threats to be managed but beloved kin to be nourished. The offerings were simple: a handful of salt, a sprinkle of grain, a few drops of wine yet charged with intimacy. Salt preserved memories as it did meat, grain promised continuity, wine, poured directly into the earth, became a shared drink between worlds. Even the timing held meaning. As dusk fell, families lit oil lamps, not to banish shadows but to guide spirits back to the underworld, their flickering flames whispering until next year. The festival's communal nature revealed Rome's deepest contradiction. In a society built on hierarchy, death was the ultimate equalizer. Senators knelt beside freedmen at neighboring tombs. Generals and cobblers alike broke bread over ancestral ashes. The Ferralia's rituals even included a public feast at the necropolis outside the city walls, where the poorest could honor their dead with scraps if needed. This collective act of remembrance forged something profound, a shared acknowledgement that no one outran time, but everyone could defy oblivion through stories. Modern parallels exist: Mexico's Dia de los Muertos, Cambodia's Pichum Ben, but the Ferralia's genius lay in its quiet duality. It didn't just comfort the living, it obligated them. Neglecting the dead wasn't just rude, it risked severing the chain of pietas, the sacred duty binding generations. When a matron left her husband's favorite figs on his grave, she wasn't just reminiscing. She was renewing a vow: "You are not gone while I remember." And as lamps guttered out at midnight, their smoke curling toward the stars, Rome slept easier knowing the dead had been seen, fed, and for another year satisfied. The Lupercalia was no orderly procession. It was a whirlwind of bear skin, flying goat hide, and ecstatic shrieks echoing through Rome's narrow streets every February 15th. Picture the scene: young men, clad only in loincloths cut from freshly sacrificed goats, sprinting from the Lupercal cave where legend said Romulus and Remus were suckled by a she-wolf. As they raced past, women lined their path, arms outstretched, eagerly awaiting the sting of the Februar, strips of hide that would supposedly banish infertility. To modern eyes, it looks like madness, but to the Romans this was sacred physics, a ritual where pain and fertility collided to spark new life. The violence wasn't arbitrary. The goats were chosen for their virility, their hides soaked in sacrificial blood before being cut into thongs. When those thongs struck a woman's palm or back, the act wasn't punishment, it was transfusion. Romans believed the whip's impact fused the animal's life force with human flesh, transferring potency through the very air cracked by the lash. Even the runner's nudity held meaning. Stripped of social markers, they embodied raw nature, their bodies becoming conduits between the wild and the civilized world, and the cave they burst from. It was the mythical womb of Rome itself, making their sprint a reenactment of the city's primal birth. But Lupercalia's chaos served a deeper social purpose. The festival temporarily inverted norms, allowing freeborn women to solicit blows from men of lower status, even enslaved Luperci without shame. In a society where female fertility was currency, this ritual granted women rare agency over their own bodies. The laughter that followed each strike wasn't just nervous relief. It was catharsis, a momentary shattering of decorum that paradoxically reinforced Rome's future. Even Julius Caesar leveraged this power, reviving the Luperci's prestige during his reign to frame himself as a fertility bringer to both land and people. What lingers most is how Lupercalia bound terror and hope in a single rite. The same whips that drove off evil spirits also invited life. The cave that symbolized Rome's savage origins became a wellspring of renewal. And the blood smeared on priests' faces, not just gore but a reminder, creation and destruction were two sides of the same blade, when early Christians co-opted the date as St. Valentine's Day, they sanitized the ritual, but something primal was lost. Modern romance trades goat hide for chocolates, yet few gestures today carry Lupercalia's visceral truth. That life doesn't begin in comfort, but in the wild, messy collision between suffering and desire. For 9 days each June, the heavy oak doors of Vesta's temple, normally sealed tight, swung open to a line of women carrying simple baskets of bread and salt. Inside, the air shimmered with heat from the sacred flame that had burned for centuries, its light reflecting off the polished marble floor where only the Vestal virgins dared tread barefoot. This was the Vestalia, a festival where Rome's mothers and daughters stepped into the literal heart of their civilization, offering humble gifts to a fire that wasn't just divine, it was the city's pulse. To let it die meant disaster. Legend claimed that when the flame flickered out during Nero's reign, so too did Rome's luck, foreshadowing the great fire that would soon ravage the city. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The Vestal's role was a paradox of power and purity. Chosen as young girls from noble families, these priestesses swore 30-year vows of chastity, their bodies becoming metaphors for the untouchable sanctity of the flame they guarded. A Vestal's touch could pardon condemned prisoners, her presence halt battles, but one lapse in vigilance allowing the fire to fade could see her buried alive in an underground chamber as punishment. Yet during the Vestalia, hierarchy softened. Ordinary women entered the inner sanctum, their offerings of spelt cakes and first harvest fruits mingling with the Vestal's own prayers. For these days, the fire belonged to everyone, its glow a shared covenant between goddess and citizen. What made the festival extraordinary wasn't just its ritual precision, but its symbolism. The hearthfire replicated in every Roman home wasn't merely practical, it was a miniature Vestal flame, linking each family to the fate of the empire. When women swept their own hearths clean during the Vestalia's closing rites, they weren't just cleaning, they were aligning their homes with Vesta's temple, weaving private and public devotion into a single act. Even the bread offerings held double meaning. Made from the oldest known wheat variety, they connected modern Rome to its rustic past, just as the flame tied present to eternity. Modern minds might dismiss this as superstition, but the Vestalia's genius was its tangible stakes. Unlike abstract gods, Vesta's fire demanded constant physical labor, feeding it the right wood, shielding it from drafts, reading its smoke for omens. Its survival proved Rome's collective discipline. When the festival ended and the temple doors sealed shut again, the message lingered: civilization isn't a given. It's a choice, kindled daily by hands both sacred and ordinary. Today's eternal flames at tombs of unknown soldiers or memorials echo this idea, but none carry the Vestalia's visceral truth. Some lights must never go out, not because they're magical, but because extinguishing them would mean admitting darkness has won. Beneath the cloak of night, far from the orderly streets of Rome, a whisper spread through the vineyards and olive groves, a call to shed not just clothing, but identity itself. The Bacchanalia began as a quiet mystery cult, a refuge for women who left their looms and children behind to dance in the woods, their hair loose, their feet bare, their voices crying out to a god who promised freedom from the iron grip of Roman virtue. Bacchus wasn't just the god of wine, he was the breaker of chains, the unraveler of minds, the divine force that could make a senator's wife forget her rank and a slave forget his scars. But what started as whispered rites in moonlit clearings soon erupted into something so uncontrollable that the Senate would eventually brand it a threat to the Republic itself. The rituals defied every Roman ideal of moderation. Initiates drank not from cups but from hollowed-out animal horns, gulping unmixed wine until the world blurred. Drums pounded like frantic heartbeats as participants, men and women alike, twisted their bodies into shapes that seemed inhuman, their movements guided by the theosis, a staff tipped with a pine cone that symbolized both fertility and madness. Some claimed to see visions, Bacchus himself stalking through the trees, his leopard skin glinting in the firelight, his eyes holding the promise of ecstasy or annihilation. Others spoke of feeling the god's presence as a physical force, as if their veins had been filled not with blood but with liquid fire. This wasn't prayer, it was possession. Yet the Bacchanalia's true danger lay in its secrecy. Unlike public festivals, these rites swore participants to silence, their oath sealed with blood and wine. When rumors reached the Senate of initiations involving hallucinogenic brews, frenzied couplings, and even alleged murders disguised as sacrifices, panic set in. In 186 BC, the Senate issued a decree so severe it was etched in bronze. The Bacchanalia were banned on pain of death. Thousands were arrested, some were executed. The crackdown wasn't just about morality, it was about control. Rome could tolerate the structured chaos of Saturnalia or the controlled inversion of Lupercalia, but the Bacchanalia's unchecked wildness threatened something deeper, the illusion that society's order was unshakable. What makes these rites so fascinating isn't the sensational rumors, but what they reveal about Roman contradictions. The same culture that built aqueducts and legal codes also craved the very oblivion Bacchus offered. Wine wasn't just a drink, it was a portal. In their cups, Romans could briefly escape the weight of their duties, the glare of their peers, the unrelenting pressure of dignitas. The Bacchanalia simply took this thirst to its logical extreme. Even after the ban, traces lingered. Look closely at Roman art, and you'll see it, the sly grin of a satyr on a household fresco, the Dionysian masks tucked into the corners of mosaics. Rome never fully exorcised Bacchus, it just learned to worship him in quieter ways. Modern parallels abound, from rave culture's pursuit of collective transcendence to the enduring allure of substances that promise escape. But the Bacchanalia's legacy is its warning. Ecstasy and order are eternal adversaries. The Romans understood what we often forget, that civilization isn't just built on laws and legions, but on the fragile agreement to suppress the wildness within. Every so often the mask slips, and when it does, the god in the vineyard laughs. The chariot races had ended, the crowd's roar still ringing in the air when the real spectacle began. The October horse wasn't just a sacrifice, it was a visceral performance of Rome's deepest fears and hopes. Picture the scene, the right-hand horse of the winning team, still slick with sweat, led not to a stable but to the altar of Mars, god of war. Its head severed with a single blow, blood cascading onto the sacred stones, while two neighborhoods, the Subura and the Via Sacra, fought like wolves over the twitching body. The Suburans wanted the head to nail to their district's wall. The Via Sacra faction dragged the tail away, dripping gore across the cobbles to sprinkle its blood on the royal hearth. This wasn't just ritual, it was a battle within a battle, a microcosm of Rome's own duality, order and chaos, unity and rivalry, all playing out in the shadow of a horse's corpse. What makes the October horse so chilling is its layered symbolism. The horse wasn't chosen at random. As the fastest, strongest animal of the races, it embodied Rome's military ideal: speed, power, and unflinching discipline. By sacrificing it, the Romans performed a kind of alchemy, transferring those qualities to their armies through Mars's favor. But the ritual's timing, mid-October, as the campaigning season ended, revealed its true purpose. This was no generic offering. It was a desperate bargain to protect the city during winter's vulnerable months. when enemies might strike at a dormant Rome. The blood wasn't just spilled, it was strategically deployed like a general positioning troops. Even the factions' struggle over the carcass had meaning. Their rivalry mirrored the eternal tension between Rome's patricians and plebeians, channeling civil strife into a controlled, sacred conflict that ultimately reinforced the city's cohesion. The most startling detail, the tale's blood on the royal hearth, that wasn't just superstition, it was political theater. By anointing the symbolic heart of the state with the horse's vitality, priests tied the fate of every Roman family to the army's success. The message was clear: war wasn't the concern of soldiers alone. It seeped into homes, kitchens, marriages, and when spring came, those same hearths would feed the sons marching off to battle. Modern cultures might balk at the violence, but the October horse's genius was its honesty. Rome didn't pretend victory came without cost. It stared into the eyes of the sacrifice and acknowledged the brutal truth that survival demanded payment in blood. Yet beneath the gore lay an even darker irony. The horse, sacred to Mars, was also a symbol of the very enemies Rome fought: Gallic cavalry, Parthian mounted archers. In destroying it, the city didn't just honor its god, it enacted a prophetic victory over its foes. The ritual was a paradox, killing what you emulate to master it. Today's sports victories might inspire parades, but none carry the October horse's raw urgency. When the crowd scattered that day, the hooves of next year's racehorses already pounding in distant stables, they left with more than entertainment. They carried a silent vow written in blood: as this horse died, so shall our enemies. The Compitalia transformed every street corner into an altar, turning Rome's labyrinth of alleys into a sacred map. Unlike grand temple festivals, this celebration belonged to the people, a patchwork of neighborhood rites where bakers, blacksmiths, and senators alike knelt before the same humble shrines. These weren't just decorations, they were portals. The Lares Compitales, spirits of the crossroads, guarded the spaces between worlds, between home and market, between living and dead, between slave and free. And once a year, Romans acknowledged just how thin those boundaries really were. What made the Compitalia extraordinary was its intimacy. Families didn't process to a distant temple. They stepped outside their doors to adorn the small, roadside niches that dotted their daily routes. The offerings were simple woolen dolls for free citizens, balls of yarn for enslaved members of the household, but their symbolism ran deep. By hanging these tokens, households performed a quiet magic, weaving the entire community, regardless of status, into a single protective tapestry. The dolls weren't just representations, they were stand-ins, absorbing misfortune that might otherwise strike flesh and blood residents. And the yarn balls. A radical statement. In death, the ritual whispered, even those bound by chains would become equal guardians of the neighborhood they'd shaped in life. The festival's timing, held sometime between the Saturnalia and early January, was no accident. As the year turned, Romans sought to reinforce the bonds that held their world together. Local magistrates, often freedmen, organized feasts where the poorest could share a meal with the wealthy, their laughter echoing under garlands of wintergreens. Even the games played during Compitalia carried layered meaning. Children's races around the shrines weren't just entertainment, they traced protective circles, their footsteps etching invisible shields against chaos. And the puppet shows, far from frivolous, they reenacted myths of the Lares, teaching generations that divinity lived not just in grand temples, but in the cracks between cobblestones. Modern eyes might overlook the genius of this ritual. Unlike explosive festivals like the Bacchanalia, the Compitalia didn't rely on spectacle. Its power lay in making the supernatural mundane, threading reverence into the fabric of daily life. When a merchant paused to tie a doll to the shrine outside his shop, he wasn't just praying, he was acknowledging that his livelihood depended on forces beyond ledger books. And when an enslaved woman placed a yarn ball beside her mistress's doll, both understood, if only for this moment, that their fates were knotted together. The Compitalia didn't erase Rome's inequalities, but it did something perhaps more profound. It forced the city to confront the truth that every life, no matter how small, left its mark on the collective spirit of the streets. The festival's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Today's neighborhood shrines, from roadside memorials to community gardens, echo the Compitalia's ethos. But what's lost is the raw honesty of those woolen symbols. Romans didn't just honor abstract unity, they stared down its contradictions. The same hands that hung puppets might whip a slave by dawn, yet the ritual demanded they acknowledge their shared dependence on invisible guardians. That tension between ideal and reality made the Compitalia more than folklore. It was a mirror held up once a year, asking a question we still struggle to answer: who gets to belong, and who decides whose spirit matters when the candles burn low? Under the scorching July sun, when the Tiber ran low and the earth cracked like old pottery, Rome did something counterintuitive. It threw a party for the god of floods. The Neptunalia wasn't just a celebration of water, it was a flirtation with danger. Along the riverbanks, makeshift huts of woven reeds and leafy branches sprang up like mushrooms after rain, their flimsy walls a deliberate provocation. Inside, citizens drank wine mixed with Tiber water, a cocktail of reverence and defiance, while outside, children raced between the structures, their laughter echoing off the sluggish current. This was no ordinary picnic. Every sip, every toast acknowledged Neptune's dual nature. The same force that nourished their fields could drown their cities without warning. The genius of the festival lay in its embrace of paradox. Unlike other gods, Neptune wasn't appeased with solemnity. He was courted with chaos. Mock naval battles erupted in flooded arenas, their splashing combatants reenacting Rome's legendary victories at sea while secretly mirroring the tumult of storms. Revelers wore shells and seaweed as jewelry, transforming the god's domain into adornment, as if to say, "We wear your power lightly." Even the feast's centerpiece, saltwater fish grilled over open flames, carried layered symbolism. To eat the creatures of Neptune's realm was to consume the very essence of his unpredictability, turning fear into sustenance. But the Neptunalia's deepest ritual happened quietly at dusk. As fires flickered along the shore, families cast tiny wooden boats into the river, each carrying a clay lamp and a slip of parchment scribbled with wishes or regrets. Some burned brightly before sinking, others drifted out of sight, carried toward Ostia and the open sea. The act wasn't just symbolic. Romans knew water had memory, that every drop evaporating under the summer sun would return as rain, that every prayer swallowed by the Tiber might someday wash back ashore, rewritten by time. The festival didn't just honor Neptune's caprice. It acknowledged water as the ultimate alchemist, turning sorrow into salt, hope into tide. Modern cultures might dismiss this as primitive hydrology, but the Neptunalia understood something science now confirms: water connects everything. When those Roman feasters raised their cups, they weren't just toasting a deity. They were acknowledging their own bodies as vessels of the same element that carved canyons and toppled empires. Today's climate crises make their ritual eerily prescient. We've built dams and desalination plants, yet still find ourselves, like those reed hut dwellers, at the mercy of droughts and deluges. The Neptunalia's legacy isn't its pageantry, but its humility. Rome ruled the known world, yet once a year, it knelt by the riverbank and whispered to the god of the unfathomable deep, "We are yours and always will be." The Conchualia began with a sound no Roman could ignore, the thunder of hooves on packed earth as chariots tore across the Circus Maximus, their wheels kicking up dust that hung in the August heat like a ghost of the harvest. But these weren't ordinary races. The horses wore garlands of wheat, their drivers' reins woven with stalks of barley, and the track itself hid a secret. Beneath the turning posts lay an altar buried in earth, uncovered only for this single day each year. This was the realm of Consus, a god so enigmatic even his priests spoke his name in whispers. Part harvest deity, part underworld sovereign, Consus presided over both the grain that fed Rome and the silent depths where that grain's seed slept between seasons. The chariots weren't just entertainment. They were a metaphor in motion, life and death racing in endless circles, neither ever truly gaining the lead. What made the Conchualia extraordinary was its literal subterranean dimension. That buried altar wasn't merely symbolic, it was a doorway. When priests scraped away the topsoil to expose its worn stone surface, they weren't just revealing an artifact, they were opening a channel between worlds. Offerings of first fruits and wine poured directly into the earth weren't simply gifts. They were transactions with the very soil that sustained Rome. The festival's timing, weeks before the autumn sowing, was no accident. This was a plea and a promise. Take these offerings, and in return, wake the seeds we'll soon entrust to you. The races, with their roaring crowds and flying dirt, were the visible half of a conversation whose quieter half happened below ground, where roots and bones alike waited for their moment. The rituals held a darker edge few modern celebrations dare emulate. After the races, enslaved laborers were given rare license to feast and compete in their own games, a temporary loosening of chains that mirrored the earth's own suspended boundaries during the festival. But this freedom carried a chilling subtext. Just as the buried altar would be resealed, so too would social order be restored by dawn. The Conchualia acknowledged a truth that unsettled even the staunchest patrician. Civilization's bounty relied on forces that cared nothing for human hierarchies. A single season of failed crops could reduce masters and slaves alike to hunger, making the festival's temporary equality less a kindness than a grim necessity. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Conchualia is how it reframed death as an active participant in life cycles. Modern cultures often treat agriculture as science and death as an end, but Romans saw both as negotiations with unseen powers. When a farmer knelt to place a handful of barley on Consus's altar, he wasn't just praying, he was bargaining. The god's dual nature, nourisher and tomb keeper, taught that every harvest began with a burial. Today's harvest festivals, with their hayrides and pumpkin carvings, retain echoes of this truth, but none dare stare into the abyss as the Conchualia did. The races, the buried altar, the uneasy truce between social classes all whispered the same unsettling reminder: life doesn't conquer death. It dances with it season after season, lap after lap, until the final trumpet sounds. The morning of the Volturnalia dawned with a hush along the Tiber's banks, where the usual clamor of docks and barges gave way to something more solemn. Romans gathered not with nets or trade goods, but with pitchers of their finest wine, their eyes fixed on the river's unpredictable currents. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a negotiation with a force as vital as it was volatile. Volturnus, the god who shaped their city's destiny with every flood and drought, demanded recognition. And so, with practiced hands, they tilted their vessels, letting dark streams of wine spiral into the water below, a liquid prayer that said, "We know your power and we thank you for your mercy." What made this ritual extraordinary wasn't just the offering, but its precision. The wine wasn't poured at random. It entered the Tiber at the very spot where the river bent sharply around the Campus Martius, a natural choke point where floods hit hardest. The choice of drink carried layered meaning. Wine, like water, could nourish or intoxicate, heal or drown. By mingling the two, Romans performed a kind of alchemy, transforming the river's caprice into something they could comprehend, if not control. Even the date, August 27th, was strategic. Marking the tail end of summer's heat, it acknowledged the looming threat of autumn storms, when the Tiber could swell from tranquil trickle to raging beast in hours. The festival's duality resonates today. Modern engineers might scoff at the idea of appeasing a river god, yet Rome's ancient fears mirror our own climate anxieties. When those Romans watched their wine disappear into the current, they weren't just performing a rite, they were admitting a truth we still grapple with, that civilization's survival hinges on forces beyond human command. The Volturnalia's brilliance lay in its honesty. It didn't promise safety, it acknowledged vulnerability, and in that acknowledgement it found a fragile balance, one we're still learning to strike. On the 11th of October, as autumn's chill sharpened the air, Romans gathered not with grand feasts or raucous games, but with something far more intimate, a single cup. The Meditrinalia was a festival stripped to its essence, the meeting of two wines, one fresh from the harvest, the other aged to perfection, poured together into a single vessel. As each participant raised their drink, the words they spoke were deceptively simple. Vetus novum vinum bibo. I drink the new and the old. But this wasn't just a toast, it was an incantation, a spell woven from grapes and time. The ritual's brilliance lay in its alchemy. By blending the sharp, untamed flavors of new wine with the mellow depth of the old, Romans didn't just create a better drink, they performed a metaphor for life itself. The young wine's fermenting energy mirrored the vigor of the living, while the old wine's settled richness echoed the wisdom of ancestors. Together, they became something neither could achieve alone, a potion that healed both body and soul. Ancient physicians prescribed wine mixed with herbs as medicine, but the Meditrinalia went further. It suggested that time itself, the interplay of past and present, could be curative. When a senator sipped that blended cup, he wasn't just tasting grapes, he was swallowing history, yet the festival's power came from its physicality. Wine wasn't an abstract symbol, it was a living substance, changing daily as it aged. The same grapes pressed in September would be unrecognizable by October, just as the people who drank them would be subtly altered by another year's passing. The act of mixing wasn't gentle, it required force, swirling the liquids until their colors blurred into unity. Romans understood what modern science now confirms: fermentation is transformation. The yeast that turned juice to wine was the same invisible force that turned moments into memory, and memory into meaning. What makes the Meditrinalia haunting is its quiet defiance of linear time. Most cultures see the past as something to honor and the future as something to chase. But in that ritual cup, the two coexisted, neither dominant. The old wine didn't overpower the new didn't erase the old. They balanced, each giving the other purpose. Modern wine tastings might appreciate vintages separately, but the Meditrinalia insisted on their connection. To drink them together was to admit a truth we still struggle with, that progress isn't about abandoning the past but fermenting with it. The festival's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Today's winemakers still blend vintages for complexity, and therapists still talk of integrating past and present for healing. But the Meditrinalia's raw honesty is rare. It didn't just nod to tradition, it swallowed it whole, acknowledging that every sip of the future carries the aftertaste of what came before. When those cups emptied, they left a question hanging in the air. What if healing isn't about choosing between old and new, but learning to hold both in your throat at once? On the 19th of October, as the last leaves clung stubbornly to oak branches, Rome's soldiers did something unexpected. They laid down their swords. Not in surrender, but in reverence, the Armilustrium wasn't a battle cry. It was a lullaby for weapons, a moment when the tools of war were treated not with bloodlust, but with the gentle care of a farmer storing his plough before winter. In the shadow of the Aventine Hill, where the war god Mars kept watch, legionaries polished blades that had tasted summer's campaigns, anointed leather straps with oils to prevent cracking, and arranged shields in perfect rows like crops awaiting the next planting season. This was no mundane maintenance, it was sacred hibernation. What set this ritual apart was its deliberate mirroring of agricultural cycles. Just as farmers sacrificed to Ceres before sealing seed stores for winter, soldiers offered lambs to Mars while storing their arms in the Armilustrium, a sacred precinct whose name meant the purification of weapons. The cleansing wasn't merely physical. Priests circled the gathered arms 7 times with burning sulfur, the acrid smoke scouring away not just grime, but the spiritual residue of war. Each pass symbolized a month of dormancy, transforming the space into a temporal womb where violence could rest and renew. Even the horns blown during the rite carried duality. Their brassy wail marked both an ending and a promise of spring's return to arms. The genius of the Armilustrium lay in its acknowledgement of war's mortality. Romans understood battle as a force with seasons, its fury unsustainable year-round. By ceremonially killing their weapons each autumn, they performed a paradox, preserving war's potential by temporarily surrendering it. The ritual even extended to social order. Freedmen and enslaved armor-bearers participated alongside citizen soldiers, their hands equally busy oiling and wrapping, as if the act of caring for tools of death momentarily erased the lines between them. Modern militaries might scoff at such superstitions, but the Armilustrium's wisdom endures. Today's soldiers still clean weapons with near ritualistic precision, and armies still rotate deployments to prevent exhaustion. But something vital has been lost: the Romans' raw honesty about war's rhythms. Their festival didn't just store swords, it confessed that even destruction needs dormancy, that the earth, and those who fight for it, must sometimes sleep. As the last shield was tucked away that October evening, the message lingered in the sulfur-scented air: true strength knows when to rest. On the 23rd of March, as spring's first warmth stirred the air, a sound unlike any other echoed through Rome, not the clash of swords or the roar of crowds, but the piercing, resonant blast of sacred trumpets. The Tubilustrium wasn't just a cleaning ritual, it was a sonic baptism. These weren't ordinary instruments. Forged from bronze and consecrated by the Salii priests, the tubi carried voices of the divine, their notes threading through every major rite, from temple ceremonies to the battlefield's chaos. To let them fall into impurity wasn't just negligence, it risked severing Rome's connection to the gods themselves. The cleansing ritual unfolded with surgical precision. Priests anointed the trumpets with oil pressed from olives grown in sacred groves, their hands moving in deliberate circles as if polishing not just metal, but the very air it would soon shape. Sulfur smoke curled around the bells, purging echoes of last season's battles, while water drawn from the Camni springs, a source so holy no mortal death could occur near it, rinsed away residue. Every step mirrored the care of a surgeon preparing instruments, but with higher stakes. A dirty scalpel might infect a body, an unclean trumpet could offend Mars, derailing entire campaigns before they began. What made the Tubilustrium extraordinary was its duality. These trumpets weren't confined to temples. They marched with legions, their blasts coordinating maneuvers that conquered nations. When a general raised his hand to signal an advance, it wasn't his voice that carried, it was the tuba's, its notes believed to carry the weight of divine approval. The ritual's timing, weeks before the campaigning season, was no accident. Like a musician tuning before a performance, Rome tuned its instruments of war, ensuring both physical readiness and spiritual permission. Even the Salii priests embodied this balance. Clad in archaic armor, they performed a war dance as the trumpets dried, their leaping steps tracing the interplay of sacred and martial power. Modern minds might dismiss this as superstition, but the Tubilustrium understood something profound about sound's power. These weren't mere noisemakers, they were psychological weapons. A legion advancing behind purified trumpets didn't just move, it thundered, its very sound waves shaking enemy resolve. The ritual acknowledged what modern science now confirms. Sound alters perception, triggers memory, even accelerates heartbeats. By sanctifying their trumpets, Romans weaponized awe itself. Yet beneath the martial pomp lay a quieter truth. The same trumpets that signaled charges also called citizens to sacred festivals, their notes weaving through weddings and funerals alike. In cleansing them, Rome acknowledged a paradox that the instruments of its greatest violence also voiced its deepest reverence. When the last trumpet was wrapped in linen and stored until needed, the message lingered like a fading note. Power, whether divine or mortal, depends not just on strength but on purity of purpose. The Aganalia unfolded like a riddle wrapped in sacred smoke 4 times a year. On dates so precisely scattered across the calendar, they seemed to trace an invisible constellation. At dawn on each appointed day, the Rex Sacrorum, Rome's highest priest, stood before an altar of unhewn stone, his knife hovering over a ram's white fleece. The ritual's name itself was a mystery. Some claimed Aganalia came from agonia, the victim's struggle. Others whispered it derived from agon, the archaic word for sacrifice. Even the deity honored shifted with the seasons. January's rite honored Janus, god of beginnings. Marches invoked Mars the warrior. May's celebrated Vediovis, the shadowy little Jupiter, while December's twisted the knife for Sol Ins, the primordial sun. This wasn't just worship, it was a palimpsest of faith, layer upon layer of meaning scraped raw by time. What made the Aganalia extraordinary wasn't its bloodshed. Rome had bloodier festivals, but its stubborn opacity. Unlike the raucous Lupercalia or the theatrical Floralia, this rite offered no pageantry, no crowds, no easy explanations. The Rex Sacrorum performed alone, his chant, Agon. Shall I strike? Met only by silence before the blade fell. Ancient texts hint that even the priesthood didn't fully comprehend the ritual's origins, attributing it to Numa Pompilius, Rome's mythic second king, who supposedly received it from the nymph Egeria in a sacred grove. The ram's entrails were red not just for omens, but as if they might reveal the festival's own forgotten purpose. The sacrifice's timing reveals deeper genius. Each Aganalia landed on an odd-numbered day, the 9th before the Kalends, a rhythm that mirrored Rome's oldest lunar calendar. The ram's blood wasn't merely spilled, it was a temporal anchor, tethering the city to cycles older than the Republic itself. When the knife pierced flesh in January, it consecrated the year's threshold. March's strike launched campaigns. May's coincided with the Lemuria, subtly linking the dead to divine favor. December's echoed the winter solstice, a plea for light's return. The same blade, the same victim, but each stroke carried distinct weight, like a single note played in different keys. Modern scholars still debate the Aganalia's core, but perhaps its power lay precisely in its ambiguity. In a religion obsessed with orthodoxy, where a mispronounced prayer could invalidate an entire ceremony, this rite thrived on unanswered questions. The blood that pooled on the altar didn't just feed gods, it nourished mystery itself. Today's reconstructed pagan traditions often crave certainty, but the Aganalia whispers an older truth. Sometimes faith isn't about understanding. It's about showing up, knife in hand, and asking, "Shall I strike?" Into the silence. On the 15th of April, when the first green shoots trembled in Roman fields, the city performed a ritual so visceral it would make modern farmers blanch. The Fordicidia demanded not just any sacrifice, but a heavily pregnant cow, her swollen belly slit open so the unborn calf could be torn free and burned on the altar of Tellus, the earth goddess. This wasn't cruelty, it was cosmology in action. As the calf's smoke curled skyward, priests chanted prayers that laid bare Rome's foundational bargain. For soil to give life, life must first be given to soil. The choice of victim was no accident. A pregnant cow embodied doubled fertility, the mother's existing life and the potential life within her. By sacrificing her at the peak of gestation, Romans performed a brutal kind of arithmetic, trading one imminent birth for countless future harvests. The ritual's timing during the Serialia festival of grain was equally deliberate. Just as seeds buried in earth seemed to die before sprouting, so too did the calf's charred remains become a grim fertilizer, its ashes mixed with ground bone and scattered across fields. Farmers watched this alchemy with reverence, knowing the blackened fragments carried more than nutrients, they bore prayers made tangible. What unsettles modern sensibilities isn't just the violence, but the raw honesty of the exchange. Unlike bloodless offerings of wine or grain, the Fordicidia stared unflinchingly at agriculture's central paradox. Creation requires destruction. Tellus wasn't some gentle nurturer. She was a deity who swallowed corpses to yield wheat, who demanded payment in kind. The ceremony's climax, where the Vestal virgins preserved the calf's ashes for the April Parilia festival, underscored this. By storing death's residue alongside sacred fire, Rome acknowledged that purity and decay weren't opposites, but partners in an endless cycle. Yet the Fordicidia's genius lay in its scalability. While the main rite occurred on the Capitol, each of Rome's 30 curiae conducted their own simultaneous sacrifice, a decentralized act of unity that bound neighborhoods through shared vulnerability. When plague or famine struck, these very curiae would later be scrutinized for ritual errors, as if a single misstep could unravel the fragile pact between land and people. The festival didn't just appease Tellus, it tested Rome's cohesion under pressure. Today's organic compost and crop rotations achieve similar ends through gentler means, but something vital has been lost: the acknowledgement that our full stomachs come at a cost. The Fordicidia didn't sanitize this truth, it thrust it, bloody and quivering, onto the altar, forcing citizens to confront the price of their daily bread. As the last embers cooled each April, the message lingered in the soot-streaked faces of those present. Survival isn't free, and the earth always collects her due. At first light on the 19th of April, Rome's grain fields became a theater of fire and fur. The Serialia didn't open with prayers or processions, but with the piercing shrieks of foxes set loose in the Circus Maximus, their tails ablaze with tied torches. This wasn't cruelty for spectacle's sake, it was a calculated strike against chaos. Romans believed foxes carried a unique malice. Legends told of one that sneaked into a farmer's field, stole an ember, and burned the harvest to ash. By turning the creatures into living candles, the festival enacted a twisted justice. Let the arsonist become the flame. Yet beneath the shocking imagery lay a profound agricultural metaphor. The fox's frantic zigzagging mirrored the unpredictable spread of crop blight, their fiery trails tracing the destructive paths farmers feared most. As the animals darted between mock wheat stalks set up in the arena, crowds roared not just in amusement, but in catharsis, each scorched tuft of fur symbolizing averted disaster. Even the timing was deliberate, held just as tender sprouts emerged from soil. The ritual acknowledged nature's fragility. One rogue spark could destroy a field, just as one act of negligence could doom a city dependent on bread. The games were only half the story. At dusk, women dressed in white carried baskets of spelt cakes to Ceres' temple, their heads crowned with braided wheat. Unlike the raucous fox hunt, this procession moved in silence, broken only by the rustle of grain offerings being laid at the goddess's feet. The contrast was intentional. Romans understood that agriculture demanded both fury and gentleness, the ruthless purge of threats and the tender nurturing of growth. When priestesses lit torches from Ceres' eternal flame to kindle bonfires in the fields, they weren't just mimicking the morning's chaos. They were transforming it, turning destructive fire into protective light. Modern eyes might fixate on the festival's brutality, but its genius was its duality. The same foxes that symbolized danger also represented cunning, a trait farmers needed to outwit drought and pests. By punishing them, Romans didn't just vent frustration, they honed their own resourcefulness. Today's scarecrows and pesticides serve similar purposes, but without the visceral acknowledgement that survival sometimes requires playing with fire. When the last embers of the Serialia faded each year, they left a question smoldering in the smoke. How far would you go to protect what feeds you? Dawn on April 21st painted Rome's hills in gold as smoke curled from thousands of tiny bonfires built not in grand temples, but in the humblest of places, stable yards, shepherds' huts, the packed earth where livestock slept. The Parilia wasn't just a festival, it was a citywide act of time travel. For one day, emperors and senators knelt beside dirt-streaked shepherds to leap through crackling flames, their togas hitched high like the rustic robes of Rome's legendary founder, Romulus. This wasn't mere pageantry. Each spark carried the same question. Could a civilization forged in wolf dens and mud bricks still recognize itself when draped in marble and conquest? The fire-jumping ritual held a precision that belied its seeming chaos. Flames were kindled with sacred wood olive for peace, pine for resilience, and stacked just high enough to force a leap of faith, but low enough to avoid true danger. As participants vaulted through the smoke, they didn't just cleanse themselves, they reenacted the primal moment when Romulus marked Rome's boundary by jumping over a makeshift flame on the Palatine Hill. The act was both purification and rebirth, the heat searing away the past year's failures while the landing on fresh earth symbolized new beginnings. Even the order of jumps mattered. Families went first, then neighborhoods, finally the city's leaders, a cascade of renewal flowing from hearth to empire. What made the Parilia extraordinary was its olfactory symphony. After the fires cooled, shepherds drove sheep through the embers, their hooves kicking up clouds of ash mixed with sulfur, a pungent blend Romans believed warded off evil. Then came the sprinkling of water drawn from sacred springs, its droplets hissing on warm stones to release steam that carried the scent of laurel branches waved overhead. This wasn't random sensory overload. Each smell mapped to a founding myth, the sulfur recalling volcanic forces that shaped the land, the laurel tied to the grove where Romulus vanished into divinity. To breathe the Parilia's air was to inhale Rome's origin story. The festival's climax unfolded at the Temple of Vesta, where the Vestal virgins blended ashes from the Fordicidia's sacrificial calf with beanstalks and horse blood, a concoction so potent it was believed to fertilize both fields and fortunes. Citizens lined up not for grand speeches, but for a smear of this sacred paste across their foreheads, a tactile reminder that Rome's greatness grew from literal dirt. Even the city's birthday cake, a rustic focaccia offered to Pales, goddess of shepherds, was baked in communal ovens, its charred edges mimicking the untamed edges of early Rome. Modern cities might hang banners for anniversaries, but none dare embrace the Parilia's raw honesty. Its rituals didn't glorify empire, they confessed how easily marble could crumble back to pasture. When the last fires guttered out each April 21st, the message lingered in the soot-streaked faces of senators and slaves alike: civilization is never permanent. It's a flame that must be leapt through again and again, season after season, lest the darkness reclaim what was won. On the 11th of June, as dawn's first light gilded the rooftops of Rome, the city's matrons moved in silent procession toward the temple of Mater Matuta. No trumpets announced their arrival, no crowds gathered to watch. This was the Matralia, a sacred space where women alone presided, their voices weaving a tapestry of devotion that men were forbidden even to witness. At the heart of the ritual stood an act so simple yet so profound: aunts cradling their sisters' daughters, presenting them to the goddess of dawn as living emblems of life's unbroken chain. The temple's inner sanctum, normally closed to all but priestesses, pulsed with whispered prayers and the scent of honey cakes offered not for the dead, but for those just beginning their journey. What made the Matralia extraordinary wasn't just its exclusivity, but its defiance of conventional roles. In a society where women's worth was often measured by their sons, this festival centered the bond between sisters and nieces, a relationship that bypassed patriarchal lines entirely. The ritual's core act, where a woman presented her sister's child to Mater Matuta, carried layers of meaning. Dawn wasn't just a time of day, it was a metaphor for renewal, for the promise that each generation could begin anew. By entrusting nieces to the goddess's care, these women acknowledged a truth rarely spoken aloud: that the future depended not just on bloodlines, but on the networks of care woven between women. The offerings revealed even deeper symbolism. The cakes baked for Mater Matuta weren't the usual salted loaves, but sweetened with honey, a substance Romans associated with both purity and immortality. As matrons broke these cakes over temple altars, the crumbs scattered like golden stars, mirroring the dawn's first rays. But the most striking taboo was the strict prohibition against mentioning husbands or fathers during the rites. For one morning, at least, Rome's women existed in a realm untouched by male authority, their prayers rising with the sun as if to say, "Life begins with us." Yet the Matralia's brilliance lay in its quiet subversion. The same women who knelt in devotion that morning would return to their households by noon, resuming their roles as wives and mothers. But something had shifted. In a civilization obsessed with legacy, this festival whispered an alternative. That continuity wasn't just about sons carrying a father's name, but about sisters passing wisdom like heirlooms. When the last hymn faded and the temple doors closed, the real ritual continued in the way an aunt might later teach her niece to read the stars or share stories of their shared ancestors. The goddess of dawn didn't just preside over sunrises, she guarded the moments when one woman's experience became another's compass. Modern Mother's Days and baby showers echo fragments of this spirit, but none dare embrace the Matralia's radical heart. Its legacy lingers in the unspoken alliances between women, the way hands steady other hands across generations. As the sun climbed higher that June morning, the temple's shadow would have stretched long across the forum, a fleeting reminder that even in Rome's marble splendor, some of the most powerful currents flowed silently between sisters between dawns. The Poplar began with silence, an eerie, citywide hush that fell over Rome every 7th of July. No trumpets sounded, no priests chanted. Instead, the streets emptied as citizens retreated behind closed doors, leaving only the faint rustle of sacred broom plants being swept across thresholds. This wasn't celebration, it was collective memory etched in ritual. The festival's name, the people's flight, preserved a terror so ancient even Romans debated its origin. Some claimed it recalled the chaos after Romulus vanished in a thunderclap, his citizens scattering like startled birds. Others whispered of an invasion repelled not by swords, but by sheer panic that sent both attackers and defenders fleeing in mutual confusion. Whatever the truth, the Poplofuga revealed a startling admission. Rome's greatness was built on a moment when order shattered like dropped pottery. What made this festival extraordinary was its inversion of typical Roman bravado. Most holidays showcased military triumphs or divine favor, but the Poplofuga enshrined vulnerability. The rituals were deliberately obscure, no grand sacrifices, no elaborate processions, just households performing small, private acts of purification. Families ate simple meals of spelt and salt, foods associated with Rome's earliest, hardest days. They wore plain tunics instead of togas, stripping away the trappings of civilization to reconnect with their ancestors' raw survival instinct. Even the sweeping of brooms carried double meaning, cleansing homes while reenacting the frantic erasure of footprints left during the legendary flight. The festival's timing in peak summer deepened its symbolism. July's scorching heat mirrored the feverish panic it commemorated, while the date, just weeks before the military campaigning season's height, served as a sobering counterpoint to Rome's later conquests. Before legions could march forth, citizens first had to remember a time when they ran. This duality permeated the rites. The same broom plants used to sweep thresholds were also tied into bundles and burned, their smoke curling upward like the distant signals of watchmen spotting an approaching horde. The message was clear: vigilance and terror were two sides of the same coin. Modern cultures might find such a festival unsettling, who celebrates collective trauma. But the Poplofuga's genius was its therapeutic honesty. Unlike today's national holidays that often sanitize history, this ritual forced Romans to confront their own fragility. When a senator's child asked why they ate peasant food that day, the answer wasn't mythic glory, it was the unvarnished truth, because once we fled. That memory, preserved like a fly in amber, became Rome's secret strength. By institutionalizing their ancestors' panic, they transformed shame into resilience, proving that true power lies not in pretending invincibility, but in remembering how close it all came to crumbling. As dusk fell on the 7th, households would finally break the silence with a single, jarring shout, a reenactment of the moment scattered fugitives found each other in the wilderness. The sound echoed through Rome's 7 hills not as a lament, but as a defiant punchline to history's joke. Every empire fears dissolution, but the Romans alone had the courage to build a holiday around it. The Poplofuga didn't just commemorate flight, it celebrated the return, the fragile, miraculous fact that no matter how far the people scattered, they always found their way back. On the 24th of February, Rome staged a ceremony so bizarre it seemed plucked from a satire. A priest dressed in archaic robes, presiding over an altar, only to suddenly drop the sacrificial knife and sprint through the forum as if pursued by ghosts. This was the Regifugum, the flight of the king, and its absurdity masked a revolutionary truth. Beneath the theatrics lay Rome's deepest origin story, the moment it traded monarchy for liberty, or so the legend went. The fleeing priest reenacted the last king's expulsion, Tarquin the Proud, whose tyranny sparked rebellion in 509 BCE. But like so much in Rome, the ritual wasn't just history. It was a sleight of hand, blurring the line between commemoration and conjuring. The mock sacrifice at the ritual's heart was no simple pantomime. The priest, the Rex Sacrorum, or Sacred King, wore the same striped toga and crimson shoes once reserved for monarchs, his very costume a walking contradiction. Though stripped of political power centuries earlier, his role preserved a fragile compromise. Rome could reject kingship without erasing its sacred past. When he raised the knife over a ram, then let it clatter to the ground, the gesture wasn't just cowardice. It symbolized the interrupted transfer of power, the divine authority Rome's founders had dared to fracture. His frantic dash through the city's heart wasn't random. The route traced the path rebel nobles supposedly took when driving Tarquin from the throne, each stumbling step a reenactment of history's stumble toward freedom. What made the Regifugium extraordinary was its ambivalence. Most revolutions paint their founding acts as flawless triumphs, but this ritual preserved the messiness. The Rex Sacrorum didn't just flee, he left the sacrifice incomplete, a theological loose end that haunted Rome for centuries. Priests later scrambled to fix the ritual with a second ceremony, the Equeria, where a horse race symbolically restored order. This two-step dance chaos, followed by controlled correction, mirrored Rome's own identity. The Republic wasn't born in a single heroic moment, but in fits and starts, its ideals forever shadowed by what had been lost. The festival's timing in February, just before the new year in Rome's earliest calendar, deepened its resonance. As winter's grip loosened, the Regifugium asked a dangerous question. Could a city truly outgrow its past, or was it doomed to reenact its founding dramas forever? When Julius Caesar later flirted with kingship, the festival's whispers grew deafening. The fleeing priest wasn't just playing Tarquin, he was rehearsing for Rome's future. Modern revolutions tear down statues. Rome preserved its kings in ritual, letting them run terrified through its streets each year. The Regifugium's genius was its honesty. It didn't pretend liberty was inevitable. It staged it as an accident, a stumble, a dropped knife reminding citizens that the line between tyrant and ruler, between past and present, was as thin as a priest's soles on February cobblestones. On the 23rd of February, as winter's grip began to loosen, Romans did something that would seem bizarre today. They threw a party at their property lines. Not with balloons or music, but with honey cakes, wine, and quiet prayers whispered to a god who refused to move. This was the Terminalia, a festival where neighbors became priests and fence posts became altars. At the heart of it all stood Terminus, the most stubborn deity in Rome's pantheon, a god so committed to his job that when Jupiter's temple was built, legend claimed he refused to yield his spot, forcing architects to incorporate his stone marker into the very walls of the sacred space. This wasn't just a celebration of boundaries, it was a recognition that limits, both visible and invisible, were what held civilization together. The rituals unfolded with deliberate simplicity. Families met at the shared boundary stones between their lands, decorating them with garlands of fresh flowers and anointing them with oil pressed from the year's first olives. Together, they sacrificed a lamb or a suckling pig, sprinkling its blood on the stone to feed Terminus, then roasted the meat over open fires, sharing the meal across the divide. What made this act profound wasn't the offerings themselves, but the unspoken contract they represented. By feasting together, neighbors reaffirmed that their lines of separation were also lines of connection, that a border respected was a peace preserved. Even the smallest children participated, passing baskets of grain back and forth across the marker, learning early that limits could be both firm and friendly. Terminus's mythology reveals the deeper genius of this festival. Unlike other gods who wielded thunderbolts or controlled harvests, his power lay in sheer immovability. His sacred stones, often uncarved and rough-hewn, were believed to be imbued with his spirit, so much so that disturbing one was considered sacrilege punishable by death. This wasn't superstition, it was social engineering. In a world without surveyors, maps, or property deeds, these markers were the law. When a farmer knelt to honor Terminus, he wasn't just worshipping a rock, he was acknowledging a system that made ownership possible, and with it, trade, inheritance, and the very concept of mine and thine. Yet the Terminalia's brilliance extended beyond real estate. Romans applied Terminus's principles to abstract boundaries as well, the lines between public and private, sacred and profane, even life and death. Magistrates renewed oaths of office at Terminus shrines, swearing to respect the limits of their power. Brides processed around boundary stones before weddings, symbolizing their transition from one household to another. Even the human body had its terminus, the threshold where skin met air, guarded by rituals to keep out illness and evil spirits. In a society obsessed with expansion, this festival was a yearly reckoning. Progress required not just pushing forward, but knowing where to stop. Modern cultures might dismiss such rituals as quaint, but the Terminalia's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Surveyors still call property markers termini, and the word terminal still denotes both an endpoint and a sacred space. Think of airport terminals where journeys begin and end. But what's lost is the raw honesty of that February ritual. Today, fences are built to keep out, not to connect. Borders are contested, not anointed with shared wine. The Terminalia understood a truth we often forget, that boundaries don't just divide, they define. And in that definition lies the possibility of trust, of community, of a world where even stone can become sacred if we agree to treat it that way. As the fires burned low on Terminalia evening, neighbors would have stood in the fading light, their shadows stretching across the very lines they'd honored. The message was clear: limits weren't constraints, but the frames that gave life its shape. Without Terminus's stubborn stones, there could be no roads, no cities, no civilization, just endless, formless space. And so they left their offerings, not out of fear, but gratitude, for the God who never moved and the lines that held them all together. The dust rose in choking clouds as chariots thundered down the flooded plain of the Campus Martius, their wheels churning the Tiber's overflow into mud that sprayed the faces of screaming spectators. This was no ordinary race, it was the Equaria, a ritual where every splattered drop, every snapped rein, every muscle straining toward the finish line became a prayer to Mars. Held twice yearly, once in March as armies mobilized, again in October as they stood down, these races didn't just honor the god of war, they channeled his fury into something Rome could harness. The track itself was a theological circuit. The oval course mirrored shields, the turning posts stood like sentinels, and the finish line wasn't just a strip of cloth, it was the threshold between preparation and bloodshed. What made the Equaria extraordinary was its brutal practicality. Unlike Greece's Olympic charioteers who raced for glory, Rome's competitors were often active soldiers, their performance scrutinized for omens. A horse stumbling at the start might delay a campaign. A victorious team from a particular legion could signal divine favor for their coming battles. The chariots themselves were stripped-down war machines, their lightweight frames designed for speed rather than spectacle. When drivers lashed their teams raw-handed, no gloves to soften the reins, but they weren't just racing. They were rehearsing. Every maneuver, from the deadly, crowding tactics at turns to the final desperate lunge, mirrored battlefield strategies. The gods, Romans believed, didn't just watch, they took notes. The rituals surrounding the race revealed deeper layers. Before the first chariot rolled, the flamed Martialis, Mars's high priest, sacrificed a horse at the god's altar, its blood soaking into the same earth the racers would soon churn. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty. The chosen horse was always a stallion, its vitality symbolic of Rome's own martial potency. Its entrails were red not just for divination, but as a grotesque map. The liver's lobes might correspond to flanking maneuvers. The lungs' inflation rate hint at endurance in siege warfare. Even the charioteer's garb carried meaning. Their short tunics dyed crimson like fresh wounds, their helmets left deliberately unstrapped to show trust in divine protection. Yet the equerria's true genius lay in its audience. Unlike the closed rites of many festivals, these races drew roaring crowds, women, children, even enslaved people cheering beside senators. The collective frenzy wasn't just entertainment, it was psychological conditioning. As citizens screamed themselves hoarse for their favorite teams, they weren't merely spectators. They became participants in Rome's war machine, their voices joining the chorus that would soon send legions marching. The festival's timing deepened this effect. The March Equirria coincided with the lustration of weapons, when soldiers purified their arms. The October races aligned with the Armilustrium's weapon storage rites. War wasn't an abstraction, it was a cycle, and the chariots were its beating heart. Modern sports events might stir patriotism, but none carry the Equirria's visceral stakes. When those racers crossed the line, their victory wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. The same muscles powering the chariots would soon drive supply carts through Gaul's forests. The same coordination between driver and team would save cohorts in Parthian deserts. Today's military exercises simulate battle, but Rome's simulations bled into the sacred. As the last chariot wheeled to a stop each Equirria, the message lingered in the settling dust. War wasn't just fought with swords and shields. It was won in the space between the divine and the desperate, where men and gods alike held their breath. The first crush of grapes underfoot sent rivulets of purple streaking through the stone troughs, their heady aroma mingling with the incense curling from Venus's altar. This was the Vestalia, not just a harvest festival, but a sensual alchemy where the goddess of love presided over the transformation of fruit into something intoxicating. On April 23rd and August 19th, Rome paused its wars and politics to honor a truth as old as cultivation itself. That wine wasn't merely a drink, but liquid desire pressed from the earth. Farmers offered clusters still glistening with mourning due to Venus Erycina, her statue crowned not with myrtle but with vine tendrils, while newlywed couples poured libations from their wedding wines into the same soil that grew the grapes. The connection was primal fertility of land and body entwined like vines around a trellis. What set the Vestalia apart was its embrace of contradiction. Venus, often depicted in shimmering silks, here wore the stains of the vineyard, her divinity rooted in labor. The rituals unfolded not in temples but in press houses, where the act of crushing grapes mirrored the violence and tenderness of love itself. As workers danced barefoot in the vats, their laughter echoing off clay amphorae, the boundary between sacred and profane blurred. Even the wine's fermentation became metaphor, the bubbling must watched like a lover's mood, its progress determining whether the year's vintage would bring harmony or strife. The festival's timing revealed deeper layers. The April Vestalia urbana coincided with the blossoming of roses, Venus's flower, while the August Vestalia rustica marked the harvest's peak. Together, they framed the growing season as a romance courtship in spring, consummation in summer's heat. But the true stroke of genius was the Celestinium, a banquet where women reclined on couches typically reserved for men, sipping wine from ceremonial cups shaped like sleeping cupids. Inverting norms, the Vestalia suggested that intoxication could be a path to revelation, not just revelry. Modern winemaking retains fragments of this spirit, toasting at harvest, blessing new barrels, but the Vestalia's raw honesty fades. Romans didn't just celebrate wine, they acknowledged its dangers. The same priestesses who blessed the vintage also oversaw rituals to prevent drunken violence. their prayers acknowledging that desire, like fermentation, must be carefully tended. As the last amphorae were sealed with resin and thyme, the message lingered in the sticky, sweet air. The divine isn't always found in temples. Sometimes it drips from crushed fruit into waiting mouths and down to the roots of everything. December 23rd dawned quiet across Rome, the winter solstice's gloom still clinging to the streets as citizens made their way to an unassuming mound near the velabrum. This was no grand mausoleum, just a humble earthen barrow said to hold the bones of a Calarentia, a woman whose legend blurred the lines between wet nurse, prostitute, and matron saint. The Parentalia was unlike any other festival. No trumpets blared, no sacrifices smoked on altars. Instead, Romans came bearing simple gifts, handfuls of millet, clay lamps, sometimes just a whispered story, to honor a figure who embodied the city's messy, miraculous origins. What made a Calarentia extraordinary wasn't divine ancestry or heroic deeds, but her radical ordinariness. Ancient sources couldn't even agree on her story. Some claimed she was the wolf's human counterpart, nursing Romulus and Remus after the beast abandoned them. Others swore she was a courtesan who inherited a fortune from a smitten lover and willed it to Rome. The most haunting version painted her as a sacrificial figure, a bride of the dead offered to the underworld, only to emerge as a guardian of the living. Rather than smoothing these contradictions, the Parentalia celebrated them. In a pantheon obsessed with purity and power, here was a festival for ambiguity itself. The rituals held at her tomb were startlingly intimate. Unlike the Vestal's grand ceremonies, these offerings required no priests. Families pressed millet cakes into the earth, a food associated with Rome's poorest beginnings. Mothers brought strands of hair, their own or their children's, tucking them into the mound's crevices, as if entrusting Laurentia with their most vulnerable moments. The act wasn't just sentimental, it mirrored her mythical role as the twins' nurse, turning every participant into a kind of foundling seeking shelter. Even the timing whispered significance. Falling just after Saturnalia's chaos, the Parentalia served as a quiet counterweight where the wild revelry of role reversal gave way to the steady, often invisible labor of caregiving. Modern historians often overlook the festival's subversive heart. In a culture that glorified military conquest and political genius, the Parentalia elevated menial work, nursing, nurturing, the unpaid labor that built Rome as surely as its legions did. The offering of hair carried layered meaning. Unlike grand sacrifices of bulls or wine, hair grew back. It was a renewable resource, much like the patience required to raise children or tend communities. Even the tomb's location near the Lupercal, where Romulus and Remus were suckled, hinted at a deeper truth. Empires might be founded by warriors, but they survived through the quiet devotion of those who fed, cleaned, and held. The festival's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Today's nurses' weeks and caregivers' days echo the Parentalia's ethos, but none dare embrace its raw contradictions. Romans didn't sanitize Laurentia's story. They let her remain both sacred and scandalous, both mother and mistress. As the last lamps guttered out on her tomb each December evening, their light didn't illuminate answers, just the enduring mystery of how civilization truly gets built. Not always by the heroes in the forum, but sometimes by the woman in the shadows, her hands sticky with millet and memory. The Aganalia unfolded in whispers. On December 21st, the shortest day of the year, Rome's usual clamor gave way to an eerie quiet as citizens gathered before the tiny, windowless shrine of Angerona, a goddess depicted with her finger pressed to sealed lips. No grand processions marched through the forum, no trumpets shattered the hush. Instead, barefoot priests moved like shadows, their offerings of honey cakes and milk left at the altar without a single spoken word. This wasn't just reverence, it was theater of the unsaid, a performance where silence itself became the sacrifice. Angerona's mythology held the key to the ritual's power. Unlike other deities who demanded praise or proclaimed edicts, she presided over secrets not as a keeper, but as a liberator. Her statue showed her mouth bound not by cloth, but by her own hand, suggesting silence was chosen rather than imposed. The festival's timing during the solstice deepened this paradox. As daylight dwindled to its slimmest thread, Romans enacted a truth their culture rarely acknowledged, that some knowledge withers in the light. The honey cakes left to darken on her altar weren't just sweets. They were metaphors for truths too potent to be spoken aloud: state secrets, family shames, the unutterable fears that fester in winter's gloom. What made the Aganalia startling was its subversion of Roman norms. In a society where public speech equaled power, where senators' voices filled the rostra and criers shouted news through crowded streets, this festival carved sacred space for the unsayable. Even the shrine's location whispered significance. Tucked near the Pontifex Maximus's residence, it stood as a silent counterweight to Rome's most loquacious office. The rituals extended beyond the temple. Families extinguished their hearth fires just before dusk, then relit them from a single, sacred flame carried by a mute child, a living emblem of secrets passed between generations without words. Modern cultures might dismiss such practices as superstition, but the Aganalia understood something psychology now confirms: not every truth demands utterance. The festival's genius was recognizing that silence isn't absence, it's a language. When a general knelt before Angerona's statue after a disastrous campaign, his unspoken confession might have spared his troops demoralization. When a merchant's widow left a honey cake for the goddess rather than airing her husband's debts, she wasn't hiding, she was healing. Even the solstice timing carried wisdom. Some griefs, like winter, need stillness to run their course. Yet the festival's most radical act was its collective aspect. This wasn't private meditation, it was synchronized silence across an entire city. For one day, plebeians and patricians alike honored the boundaries of the unspoken, creating a rare equality in what they chose not to say. The contrast with today's culture of oversharing couldn't be sharper. Where we document every thought, the Aganalia proposed that real power often lies in restraint, that the unsaid can be a gift, a shield, or even a weapon. As the solstice shadows lengthened across Angerona's sealed lips, the message lingered in the fragrant smoke of dying altar fires. Some truths don't vanish when unspoken. They grow. The Carestia arrived like a bomb after the storm, a single day in February when Rome's households laid down their grudges with the same care they'd once laid flowers on ancestral graves. Just 48 hours after the solemn Ferralia concluded, families who had whispered to the dead now turned to face the living, their tables groaning not with funeral cakes, but with honey-glazed figs, spiced wine, and loaves stamped with clasped hands. This wasn't just a meal, it was a sacrament of second chances. The Parentalia had reminded them of life's brevity. The Carestia dared them to do something about it. What set this festival apart was its radical simplicity. No priests presided, no temples opened their doors. Reconciliation happened where it always does, in the home. The rituals were disarmingly ordinary. A father passing the first slice of bread to the son he'd argued with, sisters sharing a cup of watered wine as they revisited childhood jokes, estranged cousins clasping forearms in the old Republican gesture of trust. Even enslaved members of the household were included, their presence at the feast a rare acknowledgement that family wasn't always defined by blood. The centerpiece of every table was the mola salsa, a sacred grain cake normally reserved for temple offerings. Here, it became a shared symbol that some bonds were worth consecrating. The genius of the Caristia lay in its timing. Nestled between the Parentalia's remembrance of the dead and the year's first planting season, it served as a hinge between past and future. Romans understood that grief could calcify into resentment, that mourning lost ancestors sometimes meant neglecting living kin. By scheduling reconciliation immediately after communing with the dead, they forged a psychological link. Honoring those gone required cherishing those still here. The feast's most poignant moment came when elders recounted stories not just of departed heroes, but of family feuds that had once seemed insurmountable until time rendered them trivial. Modern therapists might recognize the Caristia's techniques. The shared meal lowered defenses. The absence of formal ritual made vulnerability feel organic. Even the festival's name derived from charis, meaning dear, and emphasized affection over obligation. Unlike forced holiday truces that paper over tensions, this was a day for airing grievances with the Parentalia's lessons fresh in mind. Life is short, but love outlasts marble monuments. The laughter that finally broke through old silences wasn't just cathartic, it was an act of defiance against time itself. Yet the festival's true power emerged in its exceptions. Those who couldn't reconcile the brother who refused to attend, the mother-in-law still nursing last year's slight became cautionary tales. Their empty chairs spoke louder than any sermon. Rome had no concept of therapy, but the Caristia created a cultural pressure valve, a yearly reminder that some wounds fester if left untended. As the last crumbs were swept away, families didn't just part with full stomachs. They carried forward a quiet pact. However tangled their bonds, they'd always have this day to start untangling them again. The Caristia didn't promise perfect harmony. It offered something more realistic, a yearly checkpoint where love could outweigh pride, if only for as long as the candles burned. Imagine a festival where the simple act of baking bread became a sacred act of unity, where the glow of communal ovens under a winter sky turned flour and water into something more than food. This was the Fornacalia, Rome's movable feast honoring Fornax, the goddess who didn't just guard ovens, but transformed them into altars. Unlike fixed-date festivals, its timing shifted yearly, calculated by the Curiae Rome's ancient neighborhood divisions, so that every community could celebrate when their grain stores ran lowest, turning scarcity into solidarity. The rituals were deceptively ordinary. Families gathered at public bakehouses, their hands kneading dough side by side, their laughter mixing with the scent of rising loaves. But this wasn't just meal prep. Each loaf carried the weight of an unspoken vow that no one would eat alone and no oven would cool while a neighbor's hearth stood empty. What made the Fornacalia extraordinary was its grassroots spirituality. Fornax wasn't some distant Olympian. She lived in the crackle of kindling, the crust's golden bloom, the shared warmth of a crowded bakehouse. Her protection wasn't invoked with grand sacrifices, but through the careful placement of salt, a precious commodity sprinkled around oven doors to ward off misfortune. Even the bread's shape held meaning. Round loaves mirrored the sun's life-giving disk, while braided ones symbolized interconnected fates. When neighbors exchanged these loaves, they weren't just sharing food, they were renewing a contract that predated Rome itself. The promise that civilization survives not by hoarding, but by handing off. The festival's movable date revealed deeper genius. By anchoring it to each district's unique reserves, the Fornacalia became a living barometer of trust. Wealthy curiae with full granaries might celebrate later, their feasts lavish with honey and dried fruits. Poorer ones, baking coarse barley loaves in February's leanest weeks, turned necessity into sacrament. Yet all adhered to one rule: no household could eat their own bread first. The initial slices always went to the elderly or infirm, a tangible reminder that community wasn't just convenience, it was covenant. Modern potlucks and bake sales echo fragments of this spirit, but the Fornicalia's raw honesty fades. Today's ovens hum in isolation, their convenience robbing bread of its communal magic. Romans understood what we often forget, that sustenance isn't just about calories but connection. When the last loaves emerged from those ancient brick ovens, their heat lingering in winter-chapped hands, the message lingered too: survival tastes sweeter when shared. From the wild, wine-soaked revelry of the Bacchanalia to the hushed whispers at a Calorentia's tomb, Rome's festivals weren't just dates on a calendar. They were a masterclass in holding opposites in balance. The Romans didn't just acknowledge life's fleeting nature, they wove it into their celebrations with a boldness that still takes our breath away. Imagine a culture where the same hands that scattered beans to ward off restless ghosts also crowned themselves with roses in ecstatic dances under the spring sky. Where the laughter of role reversals during Saturnalia coexisted with the solemnity of pouring wine onto a parent's grave, this wasn't contradiction, it was wisdom carved from centuries of staring into the fire of existence. What makes these rituals so startlingly modern isn't their exotic pageantry, but their raw honesty about the human condition. While today's culture often treats death as a medical failure to be hidden or a horror to be sensationalized, the Romans invited it to the feast. They understood that joy shines brighter when cast against the dark. The Parentalia's intimate graveside picnics, the Lemuria's midnight bargains with the dead, even the Floralia's petals strewn over stages where actors performed comedies about mortality, all whispered the same truth: life's beauty isn't diminished by its brevity. It's defined by it, yet Rome's genius lay in its refusal to let this awareness paralyze. The very impermanence that could have bred despair instead fueled celebration. Why else crown a king of Saturnalia knowing his reign would end in 7 days? Why stage mock battles with aging soldiers if not to laugh in time's face? Their festivals were defiance sculpted into ritual, a collective middle finger to oblivion. Even the Vestal's eternal flame, meticulously tended yet always one careless moment from extinguishing, became the perfect metaphor. Civilization is fragile, and that's precisely why it's worth guarding with our lives. So where does this leave us? In an age of sanitized mortality, where death happens offstage in hospitals and funeral homes, Rome's celebrations challenge our discomfort. Their unflinching merger of merriment and mourning holds up a mirror. Do we truly live if we're too afraid to acknowledge the clock? The next time you blow out birthday candles or toast at a wedding, consider the Roman twist, that these moments glow brighter when we admit they won't last. Their legacy isn't in the specifics of sacrificed goats or bean-throwing chants, but in the courage to say, this matters because it ends. As the smoke of these ancient festivals clears, one invitation remains. Hit like if you're inspired to embrace life's fleeting beauty a little more boldly. Subscribe to keep unraveling history's deepest mysteries, and drop a comment below: which Roman ritual would you bring into the modern world? Until our next adventure, remember, the past isn't just something to study, it's a torch to light our way forward.